Good evening. I'm Orlo Miller. There's an old Scottish prayer that goes very well with this time of night and this kind of a location. It goes something like this. Frae ghasties and ghoulies and long-leggedy beasties and things that go boomp in the night, may the good Lord deliver us. This is Eldon House in London, Ontario, home of the Harris family for 126 years. In 1960, this house was donated by the heirs of the late Miss Amelia Harris to the City of London and is now operated together with the Victoria House Museum by the London City Historic Sites and Museums Committee. There are many antiquities and curiosities in Eldon House. One of them is my friend here on the mantel shelf, who lost his head back in 1830 over a slight case of murders. Like all respectable old houses, Eldon House has its ghost. It has nothing to do with this gentleman, who in life was no great shakes and in death was so thoroughly divided there wasn't enough left of him to make a decent ghost. No, the Eldon House ghost is completely respectable, thoroughly conventional, very pathetic, and very, very Victorian. It made one brief and rather apologetic appearance and then was seen no more. It happened about 1844. Miss Sarah Harris, a daughter of John Harris, the builder and first owner of Eldon House, was being courted by a very eligible young man, an officer of one of the British regiments then stationed in London. Sarah's parents invited the young officer to a dance at Eldon House in the early evening. Although Sarah waited for him, he didn't arrive, and the party went on without him, in this very room. As Sarah was dancing with another young man, she happened to glance toward the French windows. At that precise moment, they blew open, and there stood her suitor watching her. He looked strangely pale, and his clothing was wet, although it wasn't raining outside. Sarah's mother and father, who were near him, spoke to him, but he didn't say a word. A moment later, he turned on his heel and left by the window. The next morning, the officer's servant came to Eldon House to inquire after his master's whereabouts. He had left directions to have his evening clothes laid out, but he hadn't worn them. Later that same day, they found him. His horse had thrown him while crossing a ford on the Thames River at the west end of Oxford Street. In falling, his head had struck a stone and he had drowned. His watch had stopped at precisely 6 p.m., just as the party was beginning in this room. Well, I told you this was a very Victorian kind of ghost. Gentle, very well bred. Technically, it's called an apparition. Technically, the next story belongs also to the Victorian era, but it's a much more robust kind of haunting. It has to do with murder and the penalty for murder. I call it the unquiet grave of Pegleg Brown. This is a very pleasant location where we are now, the pleasant view behind me of the river. But this is a view that very few Londoners have ever seen, because this pleasant place is the jail yard of the Middlesex County Jail. Now, this jail yard looks pleasant enough with its plot of garden and all the rest, but actually there are many grisly memories connected with this, because this was also the execution yard and the graveyard for condemned criminals, men and one woman. One of the most famous cases connected with this execution yard is that of the hanging of Pegleg Brown some 60-odd years ago. Pegleg was accused of the murder of a man named Toohey, who happened to be one of those who was deeply involved with the murder of the 5 members of the family of James Donnelly in Vedette Township. Pegleg, like many murderers, claimed he was innocent. He continued to claim his innocence up until the day of his death. And on the day of his death, when all hope of reprieve was finally past, he told his jailers that when he was buried in the jail graveyard, that no grass would ever grow on his grave. And down below me on the hill is the place where criminals were buried. As you can see, there is a bare patch in the graveyard. This is Pegleg Brown's wooden leg. This is what hanged him. After the murder took place up on Quebec Street in London, The murderer escaped from the scene of the crime. A tremendous and very extensive manhunt was set up, and after a considerable lapse of time, a man was picked up by the American police in one of the American southwestern states and brought back to London for trial. Pegleg Brown's defense at the trial was a case of mistaken identity. He claimed that it was another man with a peg leg who had actually committed the crime. The defense put up a good show, but finally, innocent or guilty, Pegleg was sentenced to hang. The execution took place very early one morning, shortly after midnight, and Pegleg Brown was led through this door in the jail yard wall to the place of execution, which was in the alcove here. The gallows was a huge, ugly wooden construction that projected out slightly from the walls here as you see them. And at a few minutes after 12 on a morning some 60-odd years ago, Pegleg was led up to the scaffold, which was built about here. There were torches and lights showing from the windows to illuminate the scene, and after the final prayers were said, Pegleg stepped out onto the scaffold and fell through the trap. There were hundreds of spectators on Dundas Street and the area down near the river waiting to see or to hear about the execution. The lights from the windows threw huge misshapen shadows on the farther wall. The story about Pegleg that is still told to this day is that on the anniversary of his execution each year, the shadow of his body hanging from the scaffold is seen on the opposite wall of the jail here. And that's the story of the hanging of Pegleg Brown, who may or may not have been guilty of the crime for which he was hanged. Grisly little tale, an execution, a grave, and a ghost. Now, these are pretty standard ingredients, but now I'm going to take you to a place where we have another grisly tale to tell you, another grave, a set of ingredients that are much more fantastic, and another ghost. The story of the devil dog of Turkey Point. 172 years ago, a boat was beached on the shore just below here. This is a bay on the north coast of Lake Erie. It's sheltered by a promontory known as Turkey Point. The man who got out of the boat was one of the first settlers in the county of Norfolk. He came here from Pennsylvania. His name was Troyer, John Troyer. Most of the early settlers knew him as Dr. Troyer. However, you won't find John Troyer's name among the list of graduates of any medical college. Instead of a stethoscope, Dr. Troyer carried a magic talisman. Instead of wonder drugs, he administered to the sick by means of incantations, spells, and magic formulae. Dr. Troyer was a witch doctor, probably the only non-Indian witch doctor ever to practice his craft in southwestern Ontario. When a pioneer fell ill or his cattle began to die of some mysterious disease, the pioneers would send for Dr. Troyer. Frequently, his cures were much worse than the disease. This is Dr. Troyer's old farm. Even today, there is something of the eerie and supernatural about it, something of the wilderness still. Dr. Troyer was a practitioner of white magic. That is to say, he used his magic to help people rather than to harm them. Because of this fact, he claimed that he was perpetually being hounded by the powers of darkness, by ogres and witches and users of black magic. They were always trying to get at him, so he took precautions. His cabin on this farm was surrounded by witch traps, signs marked on the earth, bits of magic paper, even bear traps. Of all his enemies, however, Dr. Troyer most feared a mortal like himself, a Scottish trapper named Ramsay. Ramsay was a real person, in spite of the cluster of legends that has grown up around him. He practiced magic, too, black magic. Several of the early travelers in this area in western Ontario met Ramsay and spoke to him and wrote about him. He was in western Ontario at least as early as 1784. The Indians around here were afraid of him, and with good cause. He has been accused of the murder of several of them. It was claimed as well that Ramsay had preyed on the British military garrison at Detroit, and that on one occasion he had robbed the paymaster of a considerable amount of money, most of it in gold and silver. It was claimed, furthermore, that Ramsay had buried his loot, consisting of the proceeds of this robbery and various other misdeeds, in a certain place on Turkey Point. He had buried it with magical rites, some of them deeply rooted in the folklore of Central Europe, the place from which Count Dracula was supposed to have come, the home of vampires and werewolves. The principal part of this rite consisted in killing a black dog and putting it on top of the treasure in order to guard it. Now, Trier got wind of this cache of treasure and determined to have it for himself. Being well up in his own particular science, he thought he knew how to get it without harm to himself. Having located the treasure here on Turkey Point, Trier set out near midnight one moonless night to find their way through this gnarled and tangled wilderness. With him went his son, a young man who later became an elder in the Baptist church. The son went ahead, carrying a bell in one hand and a spade in the other. Behind him came the old witch doctor with an open Bible in one hand and a candle in the other. Bell, book, and candle. They reached the site of the treasure precisely at midnight. Young Trier began to dig, while the old man, his eyes wild and his hair blowing in the night wind, recited formula that were already ancient when Babylon was founded, or some magic rites go back to the earliest history of the human race. The sweat poured down young Trier's face as he dug, and only part of it was from hard work. Suddenly his spade struck something that gave off a hollow sound. The old man put down the candle and the book while he stooped down to look into the excavation. Young Trier gave an exclamation of triumph and began to raise the box. At that moment, something stirred in the depths of the hole, something big and black. The young man gave a yell and leaped out of the hole at a single bound. The old man stooped to recover the book and the candle, but it was too late. The candle flame wavered and flickered and went out, and from the hole oozed a great, shapeless, black something. As father and son stood petrified with fear, the shape wavered and shivered and took the form of an enormous black dog, stark against the starlit night. Trier and his son took to their heels and never again went near the spot. So far as I know, the treasure is still here. You're welcome to go and get it if you wish, but you'd better be prepared. We're in a very beautiful old London home, known to generations of Londoners as Waverley, and now occupied by the Shute Institute. This house was built 85 years ago by Charles F. Goodhu, a son of George Jarvis Goodhu, one of London's early mayors and Western Ontario's first millionaire. It would not be proper, I suppose, to say that this house was built on blood money, but it was built on money extracted from people by means within the law, but perhaps not in the most pleasant way imaginable. George Jarvis Goodhu made his money on mortgages on land mainly. I have seen Goodhu mortgages throughout Ontario, from Windsor as far east as Kingston. Goodhu charged rates of interest ranging from 10% to 25% and even more. The story is told that back in the middle years of the last century, a young Irish immigrant bought a piece of land from George Goodhu. He didn't have much money in cash saved up to make the purchase, but Goodhu loaned him the money on mortgage, the usual rates of interest, something around 28-30%. The young Irishman and his young wife had a great deal of difficulty making ends meet, and when the interest payment came due at the end of the first year, they hadn't made enough on their little farm to pay off the interest. This was the usual thing with Goodhu. This was how he made his money. He would foreclose, sell the property again as improved land for a little more money, and so on. The young Irishman, as I say, couldn't make the interest payment, and Goodhu sent out the bailiff and had him evicted. The young Irishman's wife was pregnant. They were evicted from their little farm home out on the roadside, and the Irishman's wife had her baby in the ditch. Both the baby and the mother died as a consequence. After the funeral, the young Irishman forced his way into Goodhu's office in London and cursed him. A good, old-fashioned black Irish curse. Curse unto the second and third and fourth generations. Goodhu apparently forgot the curse that the Irishman had laid on him. I say apparently. For on his deathbed many years later, apparently the thing recurred to him. On the day of Goodhu's death, he was all alone in his master bedroom in the big house on Bathurst Street, which was torn down just a couple of years ago, dying slowly and agonizingly, probably of cancer. The people, the rest of the members of the family, and even his nurse, were downstairs in one of the big drawing rooms. As they were sitting there, they heard a terrible scream from upstairs, followed by another and another. They rushed up the stairs into the master bedroom, and there was the old man, this big, tall old man with his fishy blue eyes, curled up in one corner of the bed under the great tester, his face contorted with fear, screaming at the top of his lungs with his hands held out, as if to ward off something. And in the very middle of a tremendous yell, as apparently the someone or something came closer to him, he died. Well, that's the last of our 5 cheery tales for the Halloween season. These are all traditional stories that I have heard and dug up during my years of ghost hunting in Western Ontario. You can believe them or not believe them as you choose. A lot of people have believed in them, but after all, times have changed a great deal, and with television and radio and the telephone and all our modern inventions, it's just a little bit difficult anymore to believe in the clanking chains and the witches and the devil dogs and the witch doctors and all the rest of it. Times have changed considerably. Today we don't believe in such things as ghosts, do we? Good night and pleasant dreams.